come in.
Come in, come in. Hello, how are you? Good.
Oh, that's sure. I'm going to stay sick, man.
Oh, good. I got full class. That's the fun one. I like this. I know.
It's a very la. Just delay. Last one, I got some good jaka.
All right, we're going to get started. Can you guys hear us okay online? Yes? Hopefully? Just a second.
Oh, I'm drinking this. Huh? That's good. Deborah? Deborah, they can't see. Tatani, not so the ma deb can on exchange or what. So now you on the so gone ma. Nyomon Bakiwi, Gikin Las Opakari in Bangaso share it, so that there's the same Lajani, Zinjinra Tabgona, Zinjizina Machigona, Penicini, Jimal, Matsenal, Pejotaya, Chiche to at the kitchen, Borijanko, Chinian Jajana, Pache, Nimani Sungajan.
So we're going to continue going through the way that the causes and conditions and the way that afflictions arise. And so if you pay attention and you keep some notes and you really you think about this, and you will find that there's some benefit. If you don't really pay attention and take notes and think about this, then you'll probably just forget it in the next day or two.
Ani Matsokasan Marupag Manumoki Tomambochi Shiri, Tandani Ma Penson Jigla, Marupag and Dochaki Tanda, Marupag Jedan Ketanchi, Consancho Condeshi Gamsha, Tejajinichi Gamna, Tombongazo, Sem Marupaziat, Mishipara, Tombo, Chavachetan, the Mashivala Teni, Pena Dochaki Tanchi, Docha Zedia, the Carigl. Once a worry, Pena Chalach in Tombicina, Koro Kandichi in a Tanjing Tona. Telendo Pachikena and Dochala woman. In a chalan toatel, Hachan Yapojik do Samia, John Dochik Legor. Tell Dochata Marupanik Parula Tuya and Tukaya, Sound Jambaching on the Chore, Telenam National, Turmey Chela Degor.
So when we talk about how the particularly attachment and aversion or anger and craving arise from ignorance, we're following this text, and we're following the teachings of the Dalai Lama, some advice from the Dalai Lama. And so when we talk about, for example, how craving or attachment arises from ignorance, what happens here is that when we look at an object, we don't just see the object. What we actually do is we look at the object and we superimpose these exaggerated qualities on that object. We really exaggerate, in the terms of craving, we exaggerate the goodness of the object, the desirability of the object. And that process is not itself a craving. That process actually is what we call, God, there's such not a great translation for this, that we would call this inappropriate attention, it's called in the book. But it's this sort of conceptual exaggeration that comes from the ignorance about the way that the object exists.
What the Reta? Tenima Nabji Mombochi Shediatre, Tanabjing. Jewi Cap the Sola, Thermayache, the Shirachi Shegame, Tombo Maru Patikitani, Thermayache, Kitanin, Docha, Control Narcalas opinion monke, Tenino Mongoangi later saw, Leguangitani, Letan Sem good dinner to certain remark, Leni, that young Abchican and Koalas opalatani, Korajando, Resitishore.
So if we want to look at the whole process here, of course, first we have this initial ignorance about the way that things exist. From that initial ignorance of the way that things exist, then we have this this inappropriate or attention or this conceptual sort of exaggeration of the good and bad qualities of something. From that, then we have all of our afflictions like attachment, craving, desire. We have the primary and secondary afflictions. Once we have the primary and secondary afflictions, then we create, we do good and bad actions. We create karma. And so from the creation of a karma, then we have rebirth in samsara, and the whole cycle just continues like that.
Tatanji Nyomon to Toma, Tanji Jambakini, Nyomon, Lignarke, Yonvi, Jambatela, a consensual condinalama. Sangi Korongo Son so Conjantani, Jagar Kunkepa, Tandangombo, Ledovze under Ariande Watani, but the Chuchak the Sog alone to my Mombo John, Lopoini to my Johnny, Geshe Lharampa.
So now we're going to talk more specifically really about how the specific afflictions arise, the process of the specific afflictions arising from this ignorance. And here we're following this book by His Holiness and His Holiness's advice. But of course, in this book, he is quoting many of these great teachers, such as Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Vasubandhu. And so from their scriptures, His Holiness is quoting, and the way that the different afflictions, specific afflictions, arise from ignorance.
Tombo te devja shak paksan sem gi mchapindo zea chik jandu ta tindo te lond ma jang kol kache shesa te sereze ti je lu tu zeni kap te le sangye ma son sa zu je lu tu li sare pe jana shinji ke tsawa che jana yar kata lo ma tan je te so tsama gongjo res ma to yu ki lo ma te so che de na yo shi tsawa ni ya ke ni ta so shin ko gra te le pe jar ni te jan te na jin de nga so dans ma ru pa te me pa zo to sona ani tele temperature me yepche tando cha control la so pa ta tele ke vili na yesam gu dinga chama kam ro re ze ondi su tanga so dans the maru pa me pa zo tapshi che go re zini te kondre sha.
So the first example is from a sutra, from one of the sutras of the Buddha, sutra teaching the Tathagata's inconceivable secret. And the quote from the sutra reads, Santimati, it is like this, for example, if the root of a tree is cut away and all its parts, such as twigs, leaves, and branches, wither, Shantamati, like that, if the view of the perishable collection is pacified, all mental afflictions will be completely pacified. And so the important point here is that if we are able to completely get rid of this ignorance, this afflictive self-grasping, which is the root of samsara, then in the same way that when you cut the root of a tree, the rest of the tree dies, then by getting rid of this afflictive self-grasping, this primordial ignorance, we will no longer have this inappropriate attention, this conceptual exaggeration. Then we will no longer generate the afflictions. Without the afflictions, then we no longer generate karma, rebirth, and all of samsara.
Jebet so che tni che de na yang shi dong tsawa me pa zo tong chi yore ta yang ke yong re te na je nga so nyamlin che wi kap si yang zo pi nyamlin ra wo ta ni che ta so gom na lo ma ta so che na je ji chakare ta yang ko ni ya ke yong a de son tsa wi nyamlin che ang ni te tong ba ni ke yi shi nyamlin che to na yak sho tre nga na ge ju de te ta de pe te ke cho ha ko ndo maru pa me pa zo ala tong ba ni ke to pi shi ra ma to yo ma re So
to continue this example, if you have this tree, no matter how much you pluck the fruits or cut off, I guess if you cut off all the leaves, it might kill them. If you're cutting the leaves and branches and fruits, you're never going to kill the tree from the root. The tree will continue growing. So in our example, in this way, for example, we have the practices of patience, generosity, love. All of these things are like the branches. And if we want to really get rid of samsara, what is the root? In this case, the root is this ignorance. And so the way that we get at this root is by meditating on emptiness. And it's through meditating on emptiness that we're able to actually cut the afflictions and all of samsara from the root. And so this is why the meditation on emptiness is really the most important aspect of our practice in getting rid of affliction.
Aniti water ngomola job tsawa shiram na le tanyo mo zapiter le tanyo mo na tolite ta chuli chupana tomba ni kinga pan zeni lonte te genre ati karzeta le tanyo mo kawali chongo rezeti le tanyo mo ter nam toli chongo yores nam tozeti tserme yepche nam to ta danzang na to te chole chongo yores teni le tanyo mo li ma dingar te chongo yores ta tenji Chupa ze on de tendri ma gyachembo renin rojani chu tendri gyachembo ren roat tsawani ni me pazo gona kanji che oze tombani kinga paranjaro ze tombani gomna tani ta so tsama zo togre zini komola job tere koni bati.
The next quote is from Arya Nagarjuna, from Arya Nagarjuna's. Welcome. Have a seat. There's water, hot water, if you would like hot water or tea in the back. Yeah. From Arya Nagarjuna, fundamental treatise on the middle way, which says, by extinguishing karma and afflictions, there is liberation. Karma and afflictions arise from conceptualizations. These arise from the tendency to proliferate, and this tendency to proliferate, however, ceases in emptiness. And so this is another example of what we've been saying, that to get out of samsara, we have to stop the cycle of the karma and afflictions, and that these karma and afflictions is arising from, here it says conceptualizations, but this is what we've also called inappropriate attention, or this sort of conceptual exaggeration. And that conceptual exaggeration arises from this tendency, the
That's a me check now thought of doesn't the so Nyomo by the so much, Nyomo bag dingas to younger is true there, true namata. That and you to buy the carriage in Gacraze, not on Gacraze. Cosa?
No, how come I'm the inch eager take this? So the way the Geshe Lharampa is explaining, I'm sorry that I feel like the translation in the book is maybe not quite accurate. But the way that we're going to explain this is that all of our karma and afflictions and all of our problems arise from this tendency to sort of exaggerate, this tendency to sort of see objects and exaggerate them, that here in this text is called conceptualizations. And from that, from that tendency, there's a tendency for this to proliferate, to get to sort of spread everywhere and to become bigger and bigger. However, no matter how much it proliferates, what can stop it is this emptiness. What is actually able to cut this is the wisdom realizing emptiness.
Ani lo ni pa the concept jandu zeti arian de wa lo pa arian de wa o ma jia pa konjoni lu la lu wan chipshin da tumu kala ni ke pa te nyo mo tham cha cha tumu chombi chombar nger zeni te lamdu tan dik pe jar ton ta gi ma shing cha wali pe jare ton tan so chik bare lu la lu wan le jawre ta nga so zikpo lu zeti zikpondre lu wan zeti nga so de de ko so anyon de nya so anyon ye tre tel tanga so zikpo kawal tuna rapa tuna liwan de chap de so za so at legres te nam jende tumuk zia te nyomon ba keton indi kalin reshe jamba chikar tumuk zia de at sam sam gese men jeng yor gewa che pa tumuk kawang gi son za tumuk zia te zawang korang yin ngle kama chama zawa tel tik de yor son za tumuk la ne ker ba zi te tumuk zia te tenri Gedik Tama nga son ko in nga Gedik Tama lekel chegor penen jikte ko pa po na shin jig sablo tedi chi cha de ores teacher nyomo tamcha kya temu chombi chomba jezete ta chi gitare nyomo kanji de chi na ani temu me pa so na saman gan ro res
So the next quote here from Aryadeva's 400 stanzas says, just as the tactile sense faculty pervades the whole body, delusion abides in all mental afflictions. Therefore, by destroying delusion, all mental afflictions are destroyed. So the example here is just another example, another way of looking at the same thing that we looked at with the example of the tree, is that, of course, all of our coarse body, wherever our coarse body exists, we have this sort of faculty that creates feeling, and sort of that pervades the body with this sense of feeling. So in that same way, wherever there are mental afflictions, all of the mental afflictions are pervaded by this ignorance or this delusion. And so the idea here is just another example. Therefore, because all of the afflictions are pervaded by this ignorance, if we, through understanding the nature of reality, through meditation on emptiness, cut the delusion, then we're able to get rid of all of the afflictions. And the Geshe Lharampa made a joke. The reason we laughed is that he said, then now it sort of sounds like the creator God, because it's delusion that is, it's sort of this ignorance that's creating all of these things. That's why we laughed.
Tanda jorso sevjav jaji goya chilan de so te sanji sonda gombola job ko sonda aya dewa sonda so te semjab la jatwa na ya por jima mi chigla pa shena ya nyomo ki vision bandani reta ze pa chi sheti so samsar chi shena pa ko ki shel karta yor ne she amare te sanji gutri son yore gombola job ko tri son yore lopo arian dewa gutri son yore ze shiat aso na chu gon rotan ze chena ya so ranzo tamayim batin kebanga manga ndri shen du sonza nyomo kirim bandri jeze michel pashena ya pe ya por sonza de so te to na chena ya
So it would be really great if you were really paid attention to these quotes in the sutras, and really if you can keep it in your mind and memorize it or really study it and understand it. And also, if you can share it with other people, if you can tell other people, and in this case, because it's not you saying, "Oh, it's like this," you're able to quote these great teachers, to quote the Buddha, who have taught that, "Oh, this is the way that afflictions and suffering arise from these things." And so, really, it would be of great benefit if you really pay attention to this, and also as you're able to share it to other people through these quotes of these great masters, so that they can help begin maybe to understand.
Tani tati olma tamanamje ko jayon danwarki te panta bandoba oncho tanti tamanamje pardi churare keton tamanamje te chumta chena tandi tombani she tanto sote mandraware ta chiba chikyan konin jona ya shira kyabre yo kemare kanjik danton tela na ngaji ta te jenger chance jembi de la sekiti sepikyo na reperche zetima tamanamje kutri 왜? 대말에 된조 사성 탄다라. 안도. 다다 말에 대화 말에
22, 23.
바로 뒤에 말아. 사와시럽치.
이차와시라 디와기데요. 세와시라.
Quand dans ton tela agitata gengir bazera jembi de la sécurité c'est piqué na de purchase de so kachata zo kyoro so nyamyon le gerta ngoni choni tenji quand dans ton tela na zede ondi nga so da range gi chapa so so da shu chimbo shikatse chimbo jina tela na nga zeni kati yina nga zeya chi to simple che me pa chin zangares nga zeni tsawa chemoje se jembi de la seker paziti tani tangal deki gogundu sambi dekin tondo ka sablo te kegres ta deki ke chet ani docha kontro ngar gerte so leongores ta zu ndel docha le gerdo se pazet docha docha ke yongores decho ka wangi tani soche pa kama jawa ta chumge chewa la so pig ikyonja manja chite devati chet oti
So the next quote here is from Dharmakirti, Exposition of Valid Cognition, sometimes also the Pramanavartika, and the translation in the book, one thinks about the one who sees the self, and there is constant infatuation with it. Owing to that infatuation, one craves pleasure, and that craving obscures the flaws in what one craves. And so the meaning here really is that we generate this, we observe the self and generate this, from this ignorance, we generate this incredibly exaggerated sense of self, this cherishing the self, very greatly and holding it very tightly, and develop kind of what here it says an infatuation, like a constant sort of series of preciousness about the self. And from that, then we generate this strong craving or desire for happiness and desire to avoid suffering. And once we've generated that, then from that craving, from that desire, all of our various afflictions arise. We steal, we kill, we lie. All of these negative actions arise from this exaggerated sense of self and this craving for happiness and well-being.
Katsanshia Nangere, Natso, Dochata Controta, Nargatam Chato Lasso Palajewa, Shiuchi Gavores, Yap Natso Ropan Rejixini. Te Yun Regimasini, Yonden Regix. Natso, Tangatso, Deva Guet, Tangoni Randi Noli, Nal Deva Gondu, Sam Grela son. Ta Deva Goti, Deva Dravia, Lachan Raotan, Dochata Controta, Nargatam Chato, Tetso Chejaker. Te Cheyo Maris, Jambata Niji, Tatseva, that Tombani Goni, Koroga, Semka Rangoni, Dekin Sova, the Mato National Zopa Gomsa Sopa Gom, Ani Jamba Gomsa Niji Gomba, Ni Jambata La Sopanda, Mandrakari Chesona, so young, 마치 니나야 셈컴 데몬죠. 다들 레카야 포치에서. 아니 마치 레카 디켜 장장시 디소소 많이 디야. 직대에서 배션을 지라요. 나 셈바 데모지요 좀 알아. 딱.
So, when these afflictions arise, when we do, and when we do these negative actions, like when we have jealousy or anger, or when we steal, when we lie, we're doing these things with this hope for happiness. We typically do these things out of some desire or craving for happiness, or hope, some great hope that that the result of these actions, these negative actions, is going to be happiness. But of course, that doesn't work. Really, what we should be doing is practicing love, compassion, patience, meditating on patience, meditating on emptiness, because it's through these things that we actually are able to generate and have happiness.
어떤 일도 지리 손사 맞서 남기 견성나를 차도만 섬을 yapte 마체니. 다 고소든 로바츠 마체 고소 로바체 야자니 잠다 니지다 세발라서 바로바체나 랑징거 미 잠세 첸지다 니제 첸다 젬펜 첸지나 랑징거 잔로 뜻소야 뇽로 다 컨트롤 자워던도 저침보던 자도 자워든 랑징거 소소고 자몽보 조용도 드니 메케 파차용도
So really we have to stop thinking about jealousy, anger, and these negative actions as friends. As right now we sort of think of them as friends. And we have to stop thinking about them as friends and start really thinking about love, compassion, and these things that will actually bring us happiness as friends, and start seeing these negative emotions as enemies that will actually steal our happiness from us.
Last tani ta long ni pate yang tanka namjer ka padi chu ka long ra da yo na na jen de shi da ja chalan zan dang dang da ta na yong ri ni pa tham jan jong ge zi ta ko ni ga ma ta ta ton da chik bari ndo ta tan da long chang ma ton da chik bari da yo na na jen de shi zi ti nga ze ni sa wa chim bo chi zan chen che le samlo te yo pa ni zante ani ngayin ni jobo ni nami ni pama yezini chochik tachegres ko dari ko drag jobo re taze pachik chuni daja chalatini soso gu cholan do chakkiwa ta jang chela jirdan kiwan chato kiwa aso patanji ta ranjing le yongres soso gu tiparu chonzan chi che ma to ne ko ro tang ji chayos tanda ta ta no yongri ni patam cha chong gezit te ta ki sha na re chada ma sam le yapten chuni te ta tan je wa cha son ani So
we're going to, the same text also, there's another quote. And all of these quotes are really making the same point. We're just sort of hitting the same point over and over again because it's really important. But also from Dharmakirti's Pramanavardika, or exposition of valid cognition, it says, when there is self, there is the idea of other. And from this distinction of self and other, grasping and aversion arise. And so here, what that means is that we have this perception of this exaggerated sense of self. We have this sense of the solid sense of self, which then gives us this perception of other and this exaggerated sense of other. And so from this distinction between self and other, then of course toward ourself, we develop craving, attachment, and towards others, we develop anger, hatred, aversion. And then the next two lines, it says, in connection with these, all the faults of samsara occur. So from this separation of self and other, this exaggerated sense of self and other, you have this attachment and aversion. And then from that, of course, all of our afflictions arise, all the problems in samsara occur from this distinction.
아니 단다 신고 제마서 오만 집 빠좀게 공부를 좀 말해 다 제로 하면서 오만 집 빈제 바란저 빠디 다 잡아 가디 제로 하면서 다 빠디 다 잡아 오만 집 비란저 나를 다 시스템도 찍바래 베나가솔 나비 균다 니빠제디아다 강원즈 제거레제디 수케와다 가와다 나와다 치와 땡원즈 제거레스 나소 개가 난셔제아트 미세탄 살이나 다 타르사 맹교치 고라잔이 레용그레스 예나야 테츠마 가보체사즈레제나 사칸 마고야치 다 개가 난셔게 딩가르트 메나 삽삼테 메나 삼비 참말 노고요 마리타 te tsamal yon de gores te yon de gona ta te me pazu tavshi kar geke sara chegote ke gana chite lenyo li chungores lenyo de maru pali chungores ta ke gana ch me pazu gona tsawa maru pang ngortap che sho zeni te lawore ta te tonda ta ki so ta chi bari son londe te sendro tamanda.
So from Chandrakirti's entering the middle way, the auto commentary on entering the middle way, here afflictions refers to attachment and so on, while faults refers to birth, aging, sickness, death, misery, and so on. And all those, without exception, arise from the view of the perishable collection. So, for example, in this previous thing, the previous quote where it says all the faults of samsara occur, here the faults really primarily what we're talking about are birth, aging, sickness, death, which are the key faults of samsara, and these arise from karma and afflictions, and the karma and afflictions are arising from here's the view of the perishable collection. So it's this sort of mistaken view, the over-reifying view of the self, this self-grasping. And so the antidote to that, the way that we can cut all of that is through the wisdom realizing emptiness, the way that we can cut that ignorance, which is the root of all of these problems, the root of rebirth and samsara, is through this correct view of reality, the view of the meditating on the emptiness.
Sonzata sanje shakya pa tombo chu ma son go wi jimse ngoni rawo ta nzapa gnal ko semchen kewa ta gawa ta nawa ta chewa la so pan tong ro tong son de ko la ta kyorna shi uchi le ni ta mes so shen ro ndu na de ndu gen go chang ro du tanji sam ni ta so tong de ko ta tombo ngem chong kia gi ken ngoni ta de che ra ma koron che na zaya ta tong ya ta so changma kang me wa ma se jarbo pe yin so za wan cha chembo ya po che ta ni pe ke pon ji yin sa re so za nga chon ji na ta te ngem chong ji kia sen ta sa mi jamba kang ta so tong de nga chong ngem chong ke to ma ra ta ke jimji ka chen du se ti mi so she de yo na de go ti ta ngal na yo re ti ngal ya na yo re jamba sal na chamal na yo re ta genro go re gengo chama cha yo re ti ta ra te devjen a sha chama she go re ti te devjen re chama she go re ze on ta na wa me a sha me a gengo cha me a ti thap shi ka ri yo samni tani zon de ke chu che a te tani go chung do.
And so, for example, the Buddha, when the Buddha first set off on his path, he looked at the people around him and he saw that people were suffering from birth, aging, sickness, death, and all of these problems. And of course, for himself at that time, he didn't have those problems. He had he had very good food, housing. He was young. He didn't have sickness, aging, and death. But he looked around and he saw that this was the way that everybody around him was suffering. And through perceiving that suffering, he was able to develop this Nijung. And so we translate this as renunciation, but also this just conviction to arise from samsara as a little more literal translation of this. So through seeing the suffering of other people, and it's chiefly this suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death, the suffering of samsara, that he saw this, he developed this conviction to arise from samsara. And so likewise for us, of course, most of us, we can experience this aspects of this suffering ourselves, and we can look around and see the aspects of this suffering in other people, see that we're suffering from birth, aging, sickness, and death. And so through that, we should try to develop this mind that really has this conviction to arise from samsara. And the way to actually get out of samsara is to cut this primordial ignorance through the wisdom of emptiness.
Ani tani kiaga nanchata me pazoa tamlam chi chene ni gyagaran kapte tilal tanji tramze lokpon to ke rachimo shuyo sari tanji kashi chi tsisha ke rachimo to sol chini khol kiwa ta ga ta nawa so kiaga nanch me pig ta tablam gu chuchi noro chi tanji lawon ta jo sol lokpon to tramze lokpon to sol ko ge koro ge te ni ajura mal sol tanji ngotom noro chi tanji lawon de ta lokpon to so cho so zamchur ta mo shi la so pa ta tanji go jovya go tablam ko no go nan ko sol yos tanji choro jana ina kewa ta gawa ta na ta sha me pizo ga chu to ko sol me zeni tanji lamdo.
And so in the world, of course, there's many sort of, what would we say, there's many spiritual leaders and other traditions and things that can perform miracles and that are very well learned and they can teach you many things that can help you in your life. But there's really no other teacher that has taught a method for cutting the root of samsara, a method for cutting the cycle of rebirth, from the beginning.
Sonza tani ko tapshi ma choni tani koro gom gya samlo chani koro ngem jondan le sarita tani karche ko sani tani tanda puki kars logic kawa kesa jiwa logic kawa kesa tani gom logic kawa logic gom jabra logic kawa o tedi chini gom jamni tani tamatal tomba ni tobi shirab tani tani tomba ni tobi shirab ko yomon bi sawa cheto atama konite tani cheondi sangye chu tombo te karason de zena zabje chucha wasandi machi de tavi chuji ko ni salate na kormani man ta tombo.
Let me make a correction. The Geshe Lharampa, I was speaking in today's world, but Geshe Lharampa was actually saying that at the time of the Buddha, he looked around and did not see anyone teaching this. There were many great spiritual masters at the time, but nobody was teaching a dharma that would allow them to get out of samsara. So at that time, I sort of spoke in the wrong context. At that time, the Buddha did not see anything. And so he had seen the suffering of birth, aging, sickness, and death. He had developed this conviction to get out of samsara. And so he then went to the Bodhi tree and meditated for 6 years. And what he was meditating on at that time was this ultimate nature of reality, this emptiness.
Last what tanda Londres the statue Salatena Kormani Manaki Dumberjig zeti tombo ma koro sangi on the carson resina che zavje chucha wasran di machi zeti tomba ni labdeor tomba desu tavichi desu zeti tingaso kajung desu zeti di sheti zenda ochi zajana ne mombo seto ya tenji menji sigindo teni na jeng chuchi kera sons ina ta salatena kormani pi manmanati ni stamberji ta salashena parche nandro samares sonza reji logique yen zenite sonres.
So after the Buddha achieved enlightenment, Geshe Lharampa quoted a sutra. Unfortunately, I can't quote, but I can just summarize that the idea is that after Buddha achieved enlightenment, he realized he had found this nectar, this nectar of this teaching. That in the sense that it's a nectar in the sense that, like, for example, if you take it, it cures all disease. So he had found this nectar of teaching, this incredible dharma that this emptiness of the correct view of reality that was able to completely transform him. But he also thought, I'm never going to actually be able to teach anyone. No one's ever actually going to believe me. So at first the Buddha did not teach. He just sort of rested, I guess.
Ante sonza ta sangye shaketa bagatenji lofton chenye me palatini kuro gom jab de oriti suta dingar tan deva tan nyonzeni ngat kaleche so ngat dingar nyonson jipi ngaze ate kanji rindu samni pache gomja ate teran le gomja was ngaze ate kawandu se data ton se sondi tini parshi mani ni tomba ni kangal tele to sare samudu so tangaru soya amja gendel data ton se ate kechim data ton se zen koga.
So we might wonder, like, so what was the Buddha meditating on when he was meditating? And I imagine that he was meditating on this self. Like, where is this self? Is there a permanent self? Can I find the self? Can I look at the self? And so he was probably spending a lot of time really analyzing, how does the self exist? How do I imagine the self exists? And so in that way, we should do the same kind of thing. We should really do the same analysis of the self. Where is the self? Can I find the self? Is the self in the aggregates? Really think about that and analyze that and meditate on that.
Di paron takia chishusien sapson do chase atata ndo pa chaman do charevez and ndo pa chaman do chamares kirna kirndo palan de par jampan ki chawa to ndani rinda pa lorta chancha malo pa chi yores pena ngaso jel pamba che go samni telindo pa chimbolia tenji yora jel pendos tenji ndo pa Chi yore ta ten do chamar ze loton tre de sonsa ten do chalab de mares do chagze de atkar zetin chair tel jotani shiuji yapondu sambi sarma yeche tin par tangon do go sonsa do pa chaman do chamare sarma yeche ke jotani tel do pa chimbozina jenin do chagse gore zenin do changon zen de chesham.
So the terminology is a little challenging in English because we don't have the exact words, but I would say, is all desire or all craving afflictive desire? Is all craving bad, essentially? And so no, of course there is desire that can be good. For the desire to help others is not an afflictive desire. So however, to separate that, the desire that is based on this conceptions that exaggerate the quality of things, this inappropriate attention. So when you have a desire that is exaggerating the qualities of the objects of your desire, now that is afflictive desire because it's based on this exaggerated sense of craving and importance and qualities of the object. But definitely not all desire or aspiration is afflictive, because there is good objects that we're not exaggerating the qualities of.
Also, tatani water lopo yinye ke ndo tsawa nani ma nyomon bikewi rimba chi shegendu tande yinching menching dendri yinching menching lana ha tenden dendri ke goya yo me meshita tatani ke serchi yo pare tombo tsanyo chik na tsanyo chik te ge na pan tsan nyomon ba ke tong chi ani ni ba te tsanyo chik nyenyo chik ke tong chi wo ti ke cha ching du.
And so below that in the book, there's an explanation from Vasupanda's Treasury of Knowledge about how the root afflictions arise and how the secondary afflictions arise, how the root and secondary afflictions arise from ignorance. And then really it's from the root afflictions that all of the secondary afflictions arise.
Last tani di kaptala tsanyon tal nabji yongchang la tsawi nyomomba chik lab de rin den de katul tsawi nyomomba chenra wa ja chini shendu tsawi nyomomba chazena tsawi nyomomba chik tili lokse yo mare ta tawa tal yewa nga cheja tawa jikta tarta lokta tawa chongza tsru tajin chongza de tawa la nga che tani jamba do cha kontro ngarja maruk pa techum nga ta cheta tsanyo chazena te chanro re yengi chipari tawa tsanyo chigze ti tawa zeni ching munga majaro ta tawa tel loksa nga che jana chenro re te chata jaja cheni shendu tan tso te tsnge le ya ching ro tan ro re ta tam le menge tso ha ko mara
이게 디 다왕가 당디 산윤 주 디 되어가요 지금
ke tong tsanyo chigro wa ta tsanyo cheze ya che yo re
전지
chu
산윤 주
tsanyo chuze ya ta tawa nga to.
So we often say that there's six root afflictions, right? And what are those six root afflictions? Are desire, hatred, pride, ignorance, doubt, and afflictive wrong views. There's also, you can say there's 10 root afflictions. And where do we get the other 4? It is that we can expand upon wrong views and have the 5 wrong views. In the 5 wrong views, the
tawar nga to jiktan tarta lokta tawa chongzu tsru tajin chongzu.
Okay. And so the 5 wrong views are this self-grasping, the holding wrong views, the
jikta tarta.
So holding to extremes, holding ethics and
lokta
jikta
tarta lokta.
So jikta is afflictive self-grasping. Tarta is holding to extremes, which would be extremes of annihilation or eternalism. Lokta is holding wrong views.
Ani tawan chongzun.
Then Dawa Chongzin is holding ethics and sort of ritual as the highest.
Tsru penshi chongzun las.
Okay.
Tandi raw chik cheni shendu ta counter Moli Tetum Teni Lokta Teni Jigzokta, Teni Tarns Teni, Sutrum Chons, Teni Ta, Rangatala Narger Charjala Jerdan Teter Rums and in those Savitsi the Tendichi Shendu. Counter Maki Rimba the Carrez, the Tomba, Momba, Mari Pali, Tesum Kegres, Naso Pena, Tesum Ketanjing do, Naso Langa Chindosa machine, Lampteni Pachi, with the Namjan Shigumena Teleti, Lamson. Tenro gona sani tesom de keungundo te tesom de ngete mashi bi momba de mashi wara shingiyo na gol momba maru pat me de tesom de ke mari moli tesom ke tan de shegiyore.
So the next quote is from the Treasury of Knowledge. From confusion comes doubt, from that wrong views, from the view of the perishable collection, from that the view of the perishable collection, from that the view of holding to an extreme, from that the view of holding ethics and vows as supreme, and from that pride and attachment to one's view and hatred of others' views arises in such an order. So, for example, if you come up to a road and you're trying to go somewhere, and you come up to a road and there's a split, right? If you don't know which way to go, then doubt arises about which way to go. Of course, if you know which way to go, then doubt doesn't arise. You just go that way.
송사 다 대좀리 loktakie tang de shegendu 대좀리 loktakie wa pena tanga so 나추제나 기왕 mere lamna lokta shegiyora sondi tam sergpatazo atakiwa chima yosamari tanji momboji kecha koyondi ta parshi tetsom tombo yona mena tombo yore samgejina parshi yona mena sami tetsom de tetsom nikalele ata yo kimari sani lokta ngon roja paris lokta ke tantri.
And so then how does wrong view arise from doubt? Well, for example, we have this idea in, like if we think about past and future lives, right? If you say, oh, past and future lives don't exist, that is a wrong view in Buddhism. So for example, at first maybe you think, oh, there isn't past and future lives, maybe there is, you don't know. But then over time you hear from the scientists, of course, oh, there's no such thing as future lives, there's no such thing as future lives. And so your doubt, that doubt about which one it is, by listening to sort of different people, in this specific instance, listening to science, you can decide, oh, there's definitely no future lives. That then becomes a wrong view.
Also, tani da loktali jikta kegre zindu jikta zediata nabje danza ranri danza hakondo danza yesonza tante loktali danza kege yona ta tandi nalike loktali ponsor la datan zamban ba kendu zindu te nyamyon samlo tana tese kapon jiro ta kyanga chi yo mare samondi so danza te ba keto yona mena ani legendary yo mare sandi danza te ba keto yona mena te yapo cha hakondo kanta de kegre lamto.
And so it's a little difficult from our experience to really say clearly how then we would say from that the sort of self-grasping, the afflictive self-grasping arises. But you can think that, for example, this incorrect or afflicted view of the perishable collection, which is from that the view of the perishable collection, you can also think of that essentially as self-grasping. So how that arises directly from, like, for example, the wrong view of past and future lives or the wrong view of karma and cause and effect is a little difficult to draw that direct conclusion. And Geshe Lharampa earlier said that when we're talking about this sequence, these sequences are not definitive sequences, right? It's really sort of an example of way things can arise in a possible sequence. So, but we don't have to think about this sequence, for example, as being definitely how everything arises. It's really more illustrative. But we can think, and here in this sequence, from doubt arises this afflictive view of the perishable collection, which we can understand really as this afflictive self-grasping.
Tani jiktalin tarta kegre zindu tan jiktalin tarta parchi kesare so to dakba nanjin chigda penanga so kyangap chalan ro rezitin ronke ta takba nanjin chi gyoan ro kimi te mombo chikil kyangap chikelen kelan le tan yosar pombo ta matakpari nga ta takpari so chikto panza onde takpan chini te dakban zayona tani tandan tartarin tartatal tachaki tawani yore ote.
And so once we've generated this afflictive view of the perishable collection or this afflictive self-grasping, then we develop this view of holding to the extremes. And in this case, the extremes that we're talking about are the extremes of permanence and nihilism. So in this case, for example, there are many people that hold that there is a permanent, unchanging self that goes from life to life. And the body is impermanent and changing, but there's a self that is unchanging. In Tibetan, in Buddhism, when we say permanent, we don't necessarily mean eternal, although often this belief is eternal. But this idea that there's this unchanging self separate from the body that goes from life to life. So that's one extreme of the view. The other extreme view would be that there is no past and future lives, that there is no self that continues. And so from this over-reification of, here it's called the perishable collection, which is just the aggregates, and from the self, then you have this view of either eternalism, this permanent self that goes from life to life, or this view of there being no past and future lives.
Tadani tanda tartali tajin chonza kegre zegdu dan reshetia te kapon chindu ta tanji dak patela consent chokochena doctor the tawazindu ta tarbata tamchen kimba ngo tinjo jakare samta tenin rawchigla ta chatam choyimba tenin jikshen namje chena chatam tajin chonza zya chatam chanchalo chatam ya ta panzambala tawa tele chatam tajin chonza lawor ta tanda dak takpa rawan vi daktan zanni te takpa ta trowa tawalam do takpa trowa zidi azo tarbata walash trowa takpa Tanji tawa te kanji na te ta counter zo tsawi tsingje tanji re te in sonza tanji ro kire ro tanji re la shata.
So again, it's also difficult to really explain how holding the view to extremes, like how this holding view in ethics as supreme arises in this sequence, but we can really understand that what we're talking about here, holding ethics in view as supreme, as it's explained in the book, is really holding like ethical discipline as the most important thing, or holding the vows as the most important thing in the path. And you can look and see that the Dalai Lama's explanation of sequences arising here, because it's difficult for us to really see how that's arising.
Last tani ta anchonza ke onre ta anchonza the karzeti ta tani gu chum chonza tawa chi ora te tawa yang tak pares tani gu samlo pe ya pores ni ta tawa ra so chulgi nare mi ra so na damdal ta ando ngi tawa te ya poi sa chi ora otani so tanda chum taji chonza lam ngi tawa te ya poi sa bi ta anchonza de ke ongres.
And so then you have from that, then the next thing that can arise is this holding one's view as supreme. And so this is really an extreme attachment to one's belief system or philosophy. Is like, my view is the absolute best. And so this is of course a problem, and that you're holding this sort of, the view is this sort of incredibly as the absolute best. The most important thing is the sort of specifics of this view.
Oti parta marupali tesum teni tawa nga taramba jende kevi ramba te sheondi savinyo momba dende tawandore.
And so just in summary, that from sort of the primordial ignorance, that we have these five, we have doubt, and then we have doubt, wrong view, the view of the perishable collection, the view of holding to an extreme, the view of holding ethics and vows in the extreme, and then pride and attachments to one's view, and then all of the other root afflictions. And so we have this sort of sequence of arising of these 10 root afflictions.
Tenita ngargertan do chakta jer dansam dereta te ketan de rangatala ngarger jangi jalla jer dan teter jam zeti jamba jende teni yongore zeti ta so tawa te yang ta pa ji samni ngarger ke gres ani so tawa te yang ta pa yesam ti sholan do chak ke gres ta jangi tawa goni sheon de tel tsupazani jer dan ke gres sonza And
so also we can think about then how do the other root afflictions of craving, desire, craving, attachment, jealousy, all of these root afflictions, how do they arise from these afflictive views? Well, for example, if you hold your own view as the absolute best and better than everyone else's, and you have this very partisan approach, of course, you have generated or are generating a lot of desire and attachment to your own view, and you are generating a lot of anger, spite, and aversion to other people's views. And so that is an example of how these root afflictions can arise from these 5 wrong views.
Otani ta tsanyo chiketan de tendi chire tan de ketan zoknal shendu nga tsongema zoknal ke shora ngema chitanyo de ngipa chanji rewe zena ngipar tendi ke chayin samare tendi ke yo sare.
And so again, this is really just an example of how they can arise. This is not a definitive sequence here, really. This is just a way to think about that they can arise in a way that understand how they can arise, but it doesn't have to arise in exactly this fashion.
And then kyoto takni maya chingjoyo renga chul tsanyo chitani nikapte yang tsanyo chikta tsanyo chal sheni chigle so sonza tsanyo chata kanji yemba yapo chingwan zin chita so namja gendala so sala no pa yome no pa chege yome so take yapo tan ro chida tani parishi koso kyondongo zeona des pantogre.
And so if you can really look at these 6 or these 10 afflictions and really examine, are they hurting me? Are they hurting me? And really think about this and look at this. And if you can understand how these 6 or 10 root afflictions are harming you, and then you may be able to actually begin to get rid of them.
Rồi ngã số nó chú giang ya từ chữ dân trong ta đàn ra mà trong ta nó tên chỉ là trong sẽ tiếp lo tiếp cái nào là trong rồi chứ trong sẽ nó có ya story trong ta đàn ra mà rồi tên chỉ là bộ tên chỉ xe mà im bản đi xe đi à rồi ngã số xem số cái xem lần rồi xe giàu rồi là rồi xe từ cái chú xem từ cái chỗ là cái nghe rồi rồi cái mấy ba rồi rồi Nếu xem được cho pen thọ rồi cái thì con là sao là mang tăng rồi thì thế sẽ rồi tan đã sang như chơi thế nào rực sang như chơi gì ngã số là càng nghe rồi cái sao vậy im bị chani sang như là rồi xong rồi thì là bắt đầu chơi rồi chứ
And so you can't it's important not to read this like a story and just think, oh, that's nice, but and then as soon as you're done it doesn't really do anything to you. So this isn't really to be read like a story. It's really important that when you read this, you really understand that it's talking about your mind, your afflictions, the way that the suffering arises in your mind and causes you problems. And so if you really understand that this is describing how, and you can check and see in your own mind, this process of the rising of the ignorance and the afflictions, and then you might be able to use this, you should use this and apply it to yourself to change your own mind.
ngã số là những tao bay yêu nhiều nhàng nhàng rồi anh số nhưng mà tao bay ngã số giờ lấy để yêu nhiều chứ tao mới xí số xem là tao kia sẽ làm mà chứ anh thấy đi nói chuyện của nó mới xí xem trong rồi là thay nhá xem trong rồi quá rồi là thay nhá mình ra tao đi ra chứ rồi mà ngon mà rồi mà to giúp cha sao lo tao này nhưng mà tao bay ngã số nhảm tên rồi đi như cái sao lo nhàng nhàng rồi
And so really, it's important to really every day to examine this and think about this and realize that this is what's happening in our mind every day. And so if you look in Buddhism, there's, of course, we can go into a lot of detail about all of the different minds and all the different mental factors that arise, but this is the root, this is what's happening every day in our minds, and we should really reflect on this every day.
아니 내가 저거 시야가 년년이셔 해야지 시오리다 나주고 나니 짠요주다 년년이셔 제온디 땅아 저 셈을 간이 zoya nyomo samat takasanga so samlo yapochi ta dikya ni chin dikya ta mepa zo gore yapo de nyamsa lengore jipi dikya ta so sanyo chita ni ni shita pa shi ngonza che top sona ni ro gore ta ni ni shi ngo chore tani.
So previously we went into some great detail about the different the root afflictions and the secondary afflictions, and so we can understand that all of the negative minds are contained within the primary and secondary afflictions, and that it really is the secondary afflictions that are creating problems in our mind. And so, in Buddhism, we're trying to increase the good things and decrease the bad things, and that the bad things in our mind that are causing us suffering are these primary and secondary afflictions.
아니 단 도치 양 로포이니 근저 자와나라 도차키 ngotsame go semnalo chapazoto marilir mugta nyatan chermeto tesom lingyo chowa tam chato control gili chonze ni te shendo ta tombo zawi nyomon pa chik nikable chiktere mandu chutug nyenyu ni shikar karke yo reziti ten tombo tel dochak ngotsame pa ta gopa ta serna rjetan gyapar nam chongo rezengdu ta dochak na mambo ching shegore ngotsame pa zedeate ngaso ngotsame pa ta cheme pa zeachi yore ngotsame pa zeate ta mi monton sal kyön te sol manzem ni kyön che de ni kyön che go sam ni samlo de min ton sal me yang don don de mi monton sal kyön che de ni de le ngotsame pa ze ngotsame pi samlo de gopa ota te chiglab na.
So now we're going to talk about how the secondary afflictions, there's a quote from Vasubandha's Treasury of Knowledge which discusses how the secondary afflictions arise from the root afflictions. And so the Treasury of Knowledge says, due to attachment there arises shamelessness, excitation, and avarice. Avarice, I believe, is just covetousness. Concealment is debated. From ignorance comes dullness, sleep, and non-embarrassment. From doubt, regret, rage, and jealousy arise. From doubt, regret, rage, and jealousy arise from anger as their cause. And so here we have the due to attachment there arises shamelessness, excitation, and avarice. the tango di cheme bati mishingi chedu di no chame bati nginchige nang di semon okay cheme ba
대 체메바다 월이 잠발레그리
shimati digasu di tango di shimbaki chedu di nga
체메바다 쟁근 통살이야 결을 문제입니다. 뭐사메바든 통살이 결을 대진제 문 통살
di tango di no chame bati
단다 뭐사메바드 뭔가 체메바문도
okay
좀 월말레
so in Tibetan, there's a very clear distinction when one has here it says shamelessness, but in Tibetan there's a very clear distinction between embarrassment or shame, sort of for one's own sake, and embarrassment or shame because other people see and understand that you're doing something negative. That's what I was talking to Geshe Lharampa about. Unfortunately, in English we don't make this distinction, so it's a little bit awkward to make it in translation. So I believe the first one is where it says, from attachment there arises shamelessness, excitation, and avarice. I believe the first shamelessness is the shamelessness that is based on
도착은 ngotsame patan go patan senasi tan ngotsame patan jishija tani pan go pan jishija rawa.
So the first one here with shamelessness is for one's own sake not having any embarrassment about doing something wrong.
Kerdani dochak zawi nyomomba dochak nyewi nyomomba ngake gndo ngaga tombo ngotsame patan riksari tani pa go patri yon dochak chato yezeri go pa zia tanga so gom jawi kabla shule sem lolo ndchini sem mupa chigle de chi ndo pan chi kishlo sem shon ronye jingdo o tel go pa zeri te su ndo chak chato shagores yon chi tsukpan ro zani control chi sem shlo shor sone te go pa te chakayo mari namyan ro chakayo re ma to go pa chako mar go pa su ndo chak chato re zenti shendo mayon de
And so
ngake yo ra hando chak ngake ndo ngaga ni bat
and so from attachment arise 5. And so we talked about how shamelessness arises from attachment or craving. And the second one is excitation. And so here, excitation, we can think about, for example, when we're meditating, if we sit and try to meditate, our mind will be constantly being pulled out to other things. And what pulls our mind out to these other objects? It's this desire, this attachment to these other objects. And avarice, the tikpati,
tsukpatan dale maso go patri
gopatan, gopati jila.
go pa jila senari
Sena. Oh yeah, attachment.
ngotsa me go sena
Samsung inchike la di tik tak tak. Samsung yamares. Okay, it's
a sena dan shi jani jara
do chak thing what's on me gopa sena. Okay. And so here they use the word avarice, which is like covetousness. Mishingi ki jala.
sena zeta soso chala mel tam chatri
Okay.
soso chete ya tam cha mi chete ya tam cha ndo chaka pazum de ndo chaka chato ito
So avarice here, I'm sorry, I would say covetousness. That's not right. It's not wanting to give. It's sort of now I'm blanking on the English word. It's an inability to be generous. There's a much better word in English. And so obviously it's pretty easy to see how not wanting to give up your things arises from attachment.
아니 juze de ata ta soso li yonde mena yondo chini mi so soso yonde chembo chi ro ching thona samni ti che tanda cha cha che den do ko tanji savlo chi la juze go ta gyut mat so shu yora.
The fourth one here is concealment, and the idea is that if we have attachment, and then of course we're going to conceal our faults. We're going to be dishonest about our good qualities. Of course, we do this a lot. We're often exaggerated or. So yeah, often from this attachment, we can arise this desire to conceal our faults and exaggerate our good qualities.
아니 격바제 대하다 가서 소소 그치 자얀 통야 고얀 저 체크인라고 강천이 약본 지시온데 니 소소 그 셈디 약한이 나르견 저야 마임바 주셈 약한데 니 저거 격바 Jakpa.
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
Otani chigling ones ching.
And so the ngakya teaching.
Ngarger the dates and down road that I chig su chig so check in sama yapon the chioti, mi jambali chig same they are counting in the chio set.
And so